Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about algebra. We're going to be talking about the different properties that we see in algebra. And there's three different properties that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about the commutative, the associative, and the identity properties. So go ahead and take a moment to write those three down and then leave some room because we're going to write some definitions and we are going to do a couple of examples underneath them. So we have these. These might also be note card worthy. So maybe I'll put a little star over here. All right, so the commutative property, this is the order in which we add or we multiply. So the order in which we add or multiply, it doesn't matter which way we add the numbers. So if it's 2 plus 4, that's going to be the same as 4 plus 2. It doesn't change the sum or the product. So I'm just going to write that here. So 4 plus 2 is the same as 2 plus 4. The same with multiplication. 4 times 2 is the same as 2 times 4. I also want you to write it algebraically because we learned earlier this week about variables. And so as far as variable goes, it could be A plus B is the same as B plus A. And then we would also write it using multiplication. A times B is the same as B times A. All right, so that's the commutative property. The associative property is the way that we group things when we're dealing with addition and addition and multiplication, not subtraction. So this is the way the order. In which we group numbers in adding and multiplying. Sorry, so we're going off the board here. So some examples of that would be using parentheses. So if I have the problem 3 plus parentheses 2 plus 1, so 3 plus parentheses 2 plus 1, that's going to be the same if I have in parentheses 3 plus 2 plus 1. So it's exactly the same problem. All we did was group and use the parentheses on a different set of numbers. The same with multiplication. I'll just use multiplication in this case. 3 times parentheses 2 times 1, that will give us the same answer as parentheses 3 times 2 times 1. So it's just the way that it's grouped with addition and multiplication. The last one is the identity property, and that is where the sum of an add-in and 0 is always the add-in. So the sum of an add-in, and this sounds really complicated, but it's not, and 0 equals the add-in. So an example of that would be 13 plus 0. So 13 plus the 0 will always give us 13. It'll give us that add-in. The other one would be when we're multiplying, so I guess I'll just write it here, is the factor times 1 will always equal the factor. And in this case, we'll just do 13 times 1 will always give us that factor of 13. So today, we're going to be looking at two different equations and saying whether they're equivalent or not and what property they're using. So I'm just going to give you a second to finish writing these notes, and I know you'll be writing and making sure you have these in your notebooks in just a second. So let me give you just a second to do that. All right, so let's do a problem and let's see what it looks like. So we're going to do example number 1. And I'm going to try to leave these up here. So I am going to erase our problems as we solve them just because I want to make sure we have enough time or enough space. So our first problem is 15 plus parentheses 5 plus 8. So that would be our first equation. Our second equation is this. So we sometimes see the word and, or sometimes we'll see the word equal. In this case, we'll just use the word and. The other equation they're going to give us is, in parentheses, 15 plus 5 plus 8. And they're asking us first, are they equivalent? And if they are, what property are we talking about? So first we have to solve. So first we have to figure out, okay, so I always do parentheses first. So 15 plus 13 would give me 28. And then I'm going to go over here and solve this problem. 15 plus 5 is 20, plus 8 is 28. So yes, I'm going to say they're equivalent. We can just put an equal sign, or we can say, write the word equivalent. And then I have to say what property we're using. So I'm seeing grouping because I'm seeing parentheses. And so if I look back at my definitions, I can see that the definition that's using parentheses is the associative. So I would write that down. So today we're doing a little bit of solving for the problems to say yes, they're equivalent or not, and if they are, what property are we using? So I'm just going to go ahead and erase this problem so I have room to do problem number 2. So let's take a look at problem number 2. Problem number 2 again has parentheses. It's 20 minus 12 minus 3 and 20 in parentheses, minus, in parentheses, 12 minus 3. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and solve. So 20 minus 12 is 8 minus 3 would give me 5. And as I'm looking over here at this problem, I'm going to go ahead and solve this one, parentheses first. 20 minus 12 minus 3 is 9. And then 20 minus 9 is 11. So in this case, we would say our two equations are not equivalent. Today they're going to ask us why. Why isn't this equivalent? So when I'm looking, I'm like, wow, and I'm like, just like the last problem, it's grouping and it's got parentheses and it's the same numbers, so why isn't it the associative property? The reason why is with subtraction, the associative property does not work. It only works with adding and multiplying. So for this one, they tried to use the associative property, but we can't use it when we are subtracting or dividing. All right, let's try problem number 3. Problem number 3 looks like this. 34 plus 0, and our second problem is 34. So go ahead and write that down, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at it and say, are they equivalent and what property is it? So hopefully some of you are already thinking, okay, 34 plus 0 is 34, and this one just says 34. So yes, of course they're going to be equivalent. And then we have to identify what property we're using. So as I look through these, I'm noticing that this is definitely using the identity property. So we're just going to label what property we're using. All right, let's try another one, problem number 4. So problem number 4 is 20 divided by 5 and 5 divided by 20. Go ahead and talk at your tables for a second. What do you think? Do you think these are equivalent? And if they are, what property are we using? And tell me if you don't think they're equivalent, why not? Quick big question for the day, why not? All right, so hopefully you're like, okay, well this one's easy because this is 4, and this one maybe you actually had to do some math and you got 4/10. So obviously these two are not equivalent. And as you looked at it, you're saying, well, you know what, they were really trying to use the commutative property because they were just trying to flip the two factors to figure this out, but we realized that the commutative property does not work with division or with subtraction. It only works with adding or with multiplying. All right, hopefully this is getting a little bit easier for you. All right, I'm going to give you one that I want you to do with your table, and then we're going to go into some story problems. So number 5. The problem looks like this. 5 times, in parentheses, 6 times 3, and 5 times 6, in parentheses, times 3. So go ahead and take a moment to write the problem down, figure out if the two equations are equivalent, and then tell me what property, if they are, and if they're not, why not? All right, so hopefully you were taking a look at this and you were saying, okay, well, 5 and 18, you solve that, and 30 and 3 is 90. So you were looking, wow, okay, well, it's all multiplying, and you saw that the grouping, so you figured out that yes, they are equivalent. Oh, not, they are. They are equivalent, and the property they are using is the associative property. Okay, so before we move on to the story problems, big takeaways. Big things are commutative and associative only work with adding and multiplying. They do not work with subtraction or division. So you might want to put that somewhere on your notebook to make sure that you remember that they do not work with subtraction or with division. All right, so now the second piece of the lesson today is that they're going to give you story problems. You have to actually write the expression, which we're familiar at doing, and then you have to say what property they're using. So let me erase. I'm going to have to erase a little bit of this just because it's a story problem. Okay, so number 6. So we're going to talk basketball. All right, so we're going to have a team, and I'm just going to abbreviate this really quick, as much as I can. So we're going to have 15 guards, we're going to have 4 forwards, and we're going to have 3 centers. And yes, I know all these people aren't on the field, are on the court at the same time, but these are all on their roster. Okay, so 15 guards, 4 forwards, should pluralize that, and 3 centers. And we're going to use the associative property. So we're going to use the associative property to write 2 expressions. Okay, so I found out the information. Sorry, it's like swooping here. So associative property. So I'm going to go back to my definitions and say, okay, the order in which we group numbers and adding and multiplying. So if I was to figure out how many people I have on my roster, am I going to add or am I going to multiply? Probably just going to add. So I have 3 numbers that I'm going to add. I'm going to add 15 plus 4 plus 3. I'm going to write that twice. 15 plus 4 plus 3. All right, so I know I have to solve these 2 problems, but I have to use the associative property. So I'm looking back up here, And it's basically showing that I need to group numbers differently in each problem. So even if I look at my example, the first time around, the parentheses were on the last two numbers, so I could just copy that model. Put parentheses around the 4 and the 3. And then in the second example, the first two numbers are in parentheses. So I could just put the first two numbers in parentheses. Now I have figured out how many members are on my roster using the associative property and writing two different expressions. Now obviously the last piece is to figure out how many basketball players I have on my team. So whichever way is more comfortable for you to figure out, but in the end we find out that they have 22 players on their roster. Okay, so some of the homework tonight will be taking apart story problems and using the different properties to write expressions, and then sometimes they're actually going to ask you to solve. So these are the only problems we're going to do together. Hopefully you've gotten some great notes. I know now you're going to do a couple of extra problems in your math notebooks just to make sure you understand. All right, have a great day, guys. See you tomorrow.